In 1847, in the dim glow of candlelight, within the echoing halls of Ashworth Manor, a young woman placed her final hope not in prayer or confession, but in ink. Lady Eleanor Ashworth, wife to one of England's wealthiest aristocrats, sat alone, in a chamber said to have no windows. Her hand trembled as she wrote, not because of thedraft that seeped through the stone walls, but because she believed unseen eyes lingered in every shadow. Each letter she composed carried fragments of her torment, strange rituals she claimed to have witnessed, secrets whispered through keyholes, and voices that followed her even when the room stood empty. When her writing was done, she sealed the pages in a chest and hid them beneath the floorboards, as though burying the evidence might silence the horrors they described. But secrets rarely stay buried. Decades later, workmen restoring Themenor uncovered the chest. Inside were Lady Eleanor's letters, their paper yellowed but her words still sharp, still desperate. What they revealed shook both historians and private collectors alike. Some dismissed the writings as the fevered imaginings of a woman descending into madness, the byproduct of isolation, grief, and neglect. Yet others, particularly occult researchers, insisted her descriptions aligned too closely with whispered traditions of England's ruling elite to be coincidence. The letters spoke of midnight gatherings lit by black candles, of chants recited in forgotten tongues, and of sacrifices offered not in metaphor, but in flesh. The debate over the Ashworth letters has never ended. Were they evidence of a fractured mind trying to make sense of cruelty in her marriage? Or did Lady Eleanor record the hidden practices of a class whose power stretched far beyond money? To read her words is to step into a labyrinth where fact and madness blur, where personal despair collides with the possibility of collective darkness. Some argue she was merely a neglected wife inventing monsters to explain her unhappiness. Others insist she glimpsed a truth no one was meant to write down. What makes the story endure is not only the content of the letters, but the mystery of Lady Eleanor herself. Little is known of her beyond these writings. She was born into wealth, married into influence, and yet tended her life in silence, her name absent from family portraits, her presence scrubbed from the official records of Ashworth Manor. It is as though she, like her letters, was meant to be hidden. More than a century later, the letters remain a riddle. Are they the confessions of a woman crushed under the weight of her own imagination? Or are they the testimony of someone who witnessed England's elite indulge in rituals that demanded secrecy at all costs? The truth may never be untangled. But one fact cannot be denied. Lady Eleanor's words, once buried beneath the floorboards, continue to whisper across time, daring us to ask what power is preserved by silence and what horrors are concealed by history. Ashworth Manor stood as both monument and warning, its looming facade rising from the English countryside, like a relic of an age that refused to loosen its grip on the living, and though to passing eyes it was merely another aristocratic estate, to those who lived in its shadow it was something far heavier, a weight of stone and silence that pressed itself into memory. Built in the late 18th century on the ruins of a dissolved Benedictine monastery, the house had been commissioned by Lord Peregrine Ashworth, the grandfather of Eleanor's husband, who prided himself on blending classical symmetry with the lingering Gothic bones of the old abbey, leaving behind a structure at once elegant and unnervingly archaic. The local villagers who watched its construction whispered that the ground itself resisted the new foundation, that workmen fell ill, that one even disappeared into the cavernous crypts left behind by the monks, never to be seen again. By the mid-19th century, when Lady Eleanor arrived in 1842 as the new mistress, the house was already old enough to creak with drafts and shadows, its walls thick with centuries of whispered prayers and whatever darker invocations might have replaced them. To the outside world, the marriage of Eleanor to Lord Ashworth was a match of fortune and beauty. He, a calculating figure of immense wealth, rooted in coal and trade. She, a delicate young woman of fragile features and melancholic charm, adored for her pale grace and the tragic air that seemed to follow her. Yet of those who worked within the house, the arrival of Eleanor seemed less a blessing and more a sacrifice, a lamb introduced to a den of watchful wolves. The manor itself seemed to close around her, its long corridors stretching endlessly, its staircases twisting in ways that left even servants uncertain. its east wing permanently locked, save for the rare occasions when robed visitors arrived in the dead of night, ushered in by footmen who spoke little and saw less. Eleanor's own words in her letters describe those first days with a tone that blends awe with suffocation. She wrote of the great hall, whose vaulted ceiling drew the eye upward, yet left the spirit strangely burdened, of the absence of mirrors in certain rooms, as if the family feared reflection itself, and of the peculiar stillness of the air, which seemed always to carry the faint echo of unseen footsteps. Servants gossiped in hushed tones of midnight gatherings, where cloaked guests were brought into the locked wings, their carriages arriving without crest or name, and when asked, Lord Ashworth dismissed them as business associates, though no papers ever exchanged hands and no ledgers ever recorded such dealings. Villagers beyond the estate told stories of seeing strange lights in the upper windows, as if candles burned in rooms long abandoned, or of hearing low chanting carried across the valley, mingling with the calls of owls. For Eleanor, the house was never simply home. It was a stage upon which she felt herself both actor and prisoner, watched by unseen eyes, compelled to play her role as obedient wife, while something older and darker unfolded just beyond the reach of daylight. Her earliest letters suggest she struggled to draw breath in its halls, confessing that the silence seemed to live, that she sometimes paused mid-step convinced another presence followed her, only to find the corridor empty. More unsettling still, she described the peculiar sensation of the house itself shifting, doors closing without draft, rooms that seemed to stretch or narrow depending on the hour, staircases that led to locked doors one day and opened to new passageways the next. Some historians have argued that these were symptoms of a nervous disposition, of a young woman overwhelmed by isolation in a great house, yet the consistency of her descriptions, combined with the rumors that predated her arrival, paint a picture of a place that inspired unease long before she ever crossed its threshold. The absence of mirrors became for her a particular obsession. She noted in one letter that the gallery of portraits, which should have reflected the faces of her husband's lineage, contained no glass or reflective surface, as though the family feared their own visages. In her private chambers, she requested a mirror brought in, only for it to be removed days later by her husband, who claimed superstition about broken glass, though Eleanor herself confessed she felt he feared what might be seen within it. The architecture itself told stories that words could not. The east wing, perpetually locked, bore on its exterior stonework strange markings that scholars later identified as remnants of monastic sigils, symbols of protection or invocation, depending on one's reading of history. The cellar beneath. The manor contained vaulted chambers, whose purpose was never recorded in estate documents, chambers that servants claimed to hear moaning from, on stormy nights, though any inspection revealed only damp stone and pools of stagnant water. For the villagers of the surrounding parish, Ashworth Manor was both a source of employment and of dread, a place that provided wages while draining spirit, and children were warned never to stray too close to its iron gates after dark. When Lady Eleanor first arrived, the village turned out to see her procession, marveling at her pale beauty. But within weeks the tone shifted, for already stories circulated that she walked the gardens at night with no cloak, staring up at windows as though searching for something only she could see. She smiled politely at church services but often seemed distracted, her hands trembling as if she carried an invisible burden. The vicar himself noted her unease, describing her as a soul tethered by unseen chains. Rumors clung to her husband, with even greater force. Lord Ashworth was admired for his wealth but never loved, his manner cold, his eyes described by one servant as like coins pressed too long in ice. He entertained only at night, his guests arriving cloaked, their faces hidden, and though food was prepared, it was rarely consumed. Eleanor herself confided in her letters that she often heard footsteps returning from the east wing at dawn, yet no one was permitted to enter. What began as fascination with her new role soon transformed into a sense of imprisonment, her daily life bound by rule, unspoken but firmly enforced. She was forbidden from entering certain corridors, forbidden from asking questions about the visitors, forbidden even from keeping her own diary, a restriction she circumvented by writing the forbidden letters we now hold. Whether Ashworth Manor was simply another grand estate of its era, with its Gothic airs and aristocratic coldness, or whether it was deliberately constructed as a stage for ritual solder, then the family name, remains the question that shadows every page of Eleanor's writings. The house itself, with its heavy stones and silent corridors, seemed alive with secrets, and Eleanor, fragile yet perceptive, captured them not in dramatic declarations, but in the steady rhythm of her letters, each one a breath taken against suffocation, each one a glimpse into a world where wealth masked fear, where beauty cloaked despair, and where silence was not the absence of sound but the presence of something waiting, something watching, in the spaces between. The letters of Lady Eleanor Ashworth, sealed away beneath the rotting floorboards of Ashworth Manor, and rediscovered by workmen during a renovation nearly half a century later, are today considered among the most contested artifacts in the long and troubled history of English aristocracy, for in their pages lies a labyrinth of confession, testimony, and terror, each word penned in an elegant, deliberate script that betrays not the hand of a woman in frantic delirium, but the steady composure of one determined to record her truth even as she feared that truth would never see the light of day. Addressed always to a dearest confidant, whose identity remains a mystery to this hour, the letters chart a descent, or perhaps an unveiling, of her life within the manor, blending the intimate vulnerability of a woman starved of companionship with the unflinching precision of a witness chronicling events too grave to be consigned to silence. At first glance, they could be mistaken for the typical lamentations of a neglected wife in the 1840s. She writes of her husband's coldness, of her isolation in rooms that seemed too vast for comfort, of the suffocating rituals of aristocratic life. But woven into the folds of such domestic despair are details that resist dismissal, descriptions that breathe of otherworldly presences, of practice hidden behind locked doors, of shadows that did not belong to the architecture of the manor itself. Again and again, she returns to the image of voices whispering her name in the nursery, though no child had yet been born to fill its crib. Voices she describes as soft, almost coaxing, yet threaded with malice, as if urging her to surrender herself to some unseen will. She speaks of guests who arrived at midnight meals yet left no trace of their presence, no shadows under candlelight, no warmth upon the chairs they occupied, no reflection in the silver mirrors she had secretly installed before Lord Ashworth ordered them removed. More chilling still are her accounts of her husband reciting prayers in a language she could not understand, a guttural cadence that rattled through the corridors and lingered in the air long after the sound had ceased. Language she later claimed to have, recognized in the mutterings of the cloaked visitors who disappeared into the East Wing. The rituals she describes bear all the hallmarks of structured liturgy, yet they were stripped of sanctity and dressed in fear. Circles of salt inscribed upon stone floors, chanting that rose and fell in rhythms not unlike the hymns of the church. Offerings left behind that stained the stones dark, as though blood had seeped into the very foundation of the manor. At hymns she writes with the curiosity of one who watches from the shadows, describing the participants with a painter's eye for detail. The curve of their hands as they gestured, the glint of a hidden blade, the way the air seemed to thicken, until breath itself was an effort. At other times she writes with the trembling hand of a prisoner, confessing her loneliness, her longing for freedom, her fear that she was not of sound mind, a refrain that haunts the letters, suggesting both her self-doubt and her awareness that her testimony might one day be dismissed as hysteria. And indeed, when the letters were first revealed, historians eager to preserve the reputations of England's ruling families were quick to brand them the ramblings of a depressed and isolated woman, citing her seclusion, her delicate constitution, and the melancholic temperament that had been noted even at her marriage. Yet the persistence of her imagery, the careful ordering of her accounts, and the chilling consistency between her words and the rumors that had circulated in the village for decades resist such easy categorization. One letter in particular, dated November 1845, recounts her discovery of a small book bound in leather, hidden within her husband's study, filled with symbols she did not recognize, symbols that later scholars identified as sigils associated with pre-Christian ritual magic. She described how upon touching the book, she felt a shiver run through her body as though the very ink upon the page resisted her fingers, and she swore she heard her own name whispered from behind her, though she was alone. In another, she writes, of awakening to find her bedroom door ajar though she had locked it herself, and of seeing at the threshold, not her husband, but a figure tall and shrouded, its face obscured, its hand raised as if in benediction, or in curse. She speaks of faint lights hovering in the east wing when the moon was high, of smells of burnt herbs wafting through the corridors, of the distinct sound of children laughing though none lived within the house, laughter that stopped the moment she entered the rooms from which it came. The letters grow increasingly desperate as time passes, not merely in their tone but in their sense of isolation, as though she were writing into a void, uncertain if her words would ever reach her dearest confidant, or if the confidant even existed at all. Some scholars have suggested that the confidant was a fabrication, a device that allowed her to pour her thoughts onto paper with the illusion of being heard, while others speculate that the confidant was real, perhaps a former lover, a trusted servant, or even a member of the clergy sworn to secrecy. Whoever it was, the intimacy of her voice cannot be denied. She writes not as one performing for history, but as one pleading for understanding, for validation, for escape. Yet the greatest question remains. Were these letters the cries of a suffering woman, driven to madness by isolation and the oppressive atmosphere of the manor, or were they forbidden testimony, smuggled through ink, meant to expose the hidden practices of an aristocracy whose wealth was preserved not merely by coal and commerce, but by bargains struck in shadow and silence? The duality of their nature is precisely what gives them their power. On one page, she confesses her longing to walk freely in the village, to hear children's voices in daylight rather than in nightmares, to feel the sun upon her face without, the shadow of the house trailing behind her. On the next, she describes in chilling detail the sound of chanting from the east wing, the way the very walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm, the echo of screams muffled as if swallowed by stone. Again and again she questions her own sanity, and yet her descriptions remain lucid, consistent, almost clinical in their observation. If madness it was madness that documented itself with the clarity of a ledger. Those who dismiss the letters as fiction must account for the specificity of their imagery, the repeated mention of salt circles, the stains upon stone floors later. Confirmed by renovators, the peculiar absence of mirrors documented not only by Eleanor but by servants and villagers alike. Those who embrace them as truth must reckon with the possibility that beneath the elegance of England's aristocracy lay a current of secrecy far darker than any scandal of money or infidelity, a current that required silence, sacrifice, and complicity. To read the letters is to enter a space where confession and testimony blur, where fear and fact intertwine, where a woman's loneliness becomes both a window into her psyche and a key to unlocking the secrets of a house built upon ruins. And whether one believes them to be the diary of a melancholic wife or the hidden record of aristocratic occult practices, their effect is the same. They draw their reader into the suffocating corridors of Ashworth Manor, where shadows speak, where voices whisper, and where ink itself becomes an act of resistance against silence. When scholars first unsealed the letters of Lady Eleanor Ashworth, they did not simply inherit the words of one troubled woman, they inherited a battlefield of interpretation, a mirror in which religion, psychology, and power reflected not just upon Eleanor, but upon the entire society that surrounded her, for every institution that touched her life, church, medicine, family, sought to define her voice according to its own authority, to claim her testimony not as her own, but as evidence for their chosen narrative, and in that struggle for ownership, the true meaning of her words became ever more elusive. The Church, steadfast in its role as moral arbiter of 19th-century England, seized upon her descriptions of chanting, salt circles, and spectral voices as proof not merely of her vulnerability, but of the devil's direct presence within Ashworth Manor. Yet even as priests declared her letters a map of the devil's hand, they did not treat her as a prophet or martyr. Instead, they condemned her for daring to speak against her husband, for a wife's duty, in the rigid theology of the time, was silence, obedience, and loyalty, no matter what shadows haunted her chambers. In sermons whispered through the parish, Eleanor became a cautionary tale, not of courage but of weakness, a woman who had opened herself to temptation by questioning her Lord, thereby opening the door for Satan himself. Such condemnation was convenient, for it placed blame upon her rather than upon the ritual she described, redirecting suspicion away from the corridors of the elite and back toward the supposed frailty of the female soul. Physicians, meanwhile, approached her letters not as spiritual warnings but as clinical specimens. The mid-19th century was a crucible of emerging psychological thought, and women's suffering was often classified under the ever-elastic diagnosis of hysteria, a term that pathologized grief, longing, resistance, and trauma under the guise of science. Eleanor's loneliness became, in the hands of doctors, not evidence of abuse, but a symptom of her own biology. The voices she heard were hallucinations born of nerves. The rituals she described were projections of a restless imagination, her longing for freedom, the dangerous stirrings of an unstable temperament. To read her words through such alans was to strip them of context, to deny the possibility that they described real events, and instead to reduce them to chemical imbalance, to ovaries and humors, to the presumed instability of a woman left too long without purpose. Yet such medical judgments, cloaked in the language of science, were as much about preserving power as the sermons of priests, for to declare her mad was to preserve the reputation of Lord Ashworth, to maintain the illusion of aristocratic integrity, to prevent scandal from staining the institutions that fed upon the wealth of families like his. And yet beneath these dismissals, an unsettling undercurrent remained. Certain scholars, particularly those with knowledge of arcane texts circulating quietly in Europe since the 18th century, could not help but notice the striking parallels between Eleanor's letters and ritual descriptions found in grimoires long banned by both church and state. The salt circles, the guttural chanting, the offerings upon stone floors. These were not inventions unique to a lonely woman, but echoed practices recorded in works like the Clavicula Salomonis and the Compendium Maleficarum. Could it be mere coincidence that her private writings aligned so precisely with texts she likely never encountered? If she was mad, her madness was uncannily literate in traditions of ritual magic, traditions that were whispered to still find patrons among Europe's powerful. The question sharpened. Was Eleanor's mind fracturing under isolation and cruelty, or had she indeed stumbled upon rituals her husband and his circle sought desperately to conceal? To approach her letters is therefore to confront not simply a binary of truth versus delusion, but a labyrinth in which both may intertwine. Psychology suggests she bore the crushing weight of neglect and coercive control, her yearning for freedom manifesting in visions of shadowy figures and whispered voices, the architecture of the manor itself becoming a stage upon which her trauma projected phantoms. Religion, however, insists that what she described bore the unmistakable marks of demonic intrusion, that her home was not simply haunted by grief, but by entities older and more cunning than human cruelty. And standing between these interpretations lies the question of power, for Eleanor's voice wassilanced not by reasoned debate, but by force. Her husband dismissed her accounts, forbade her correspondence, and restricted her movements. The church branded her dangerous to herself. Physicians declared her disordered. At every turn, the institutions designed to protect instead preserved silence. One can almost hear in her words a desperate attempt not merely to describe, but to resist. If my voice trembles, let it be recorded. If my hands fail, let the ink remain. Such a sentence preserved in one letter reveals the consciousness of a woman aware that her testimony might be erased, that her survival depended upon words outlasting her body. But can testimony survive when every power conspires against it? To modernize, Eleanor becomes emblematic of the intersection where gender, authority, and belief collide. If she was mad, then she was crushed by the very conditions that ensured her madness. An isolated manor, an unfeeling husband, a society that rendered female pain illegible except as pathology. If she was sane, then she was silenced precisely because her testimony threatened to reveal truths too dangerous for aristocracy, religion, or medicine to acknowledge. Either way, her words unveil thus some chilling reality. Truth is shaped not only by what is written, but by who is permitted to read, believe, and preserve it. And so her letters become mirrors in which every institution sees itself. The church sees sin, medicine sees disorder. Scholars see echoes of forbidden knowledge, while readers see a woman torn between doubt and conviction, sanity and revelation. The debate has never ended, for the letters resist resolution. They demand the reader choose between empathy and skepticism, between faith and doubt, between the comfort of dismissal and the unease of belief. Perhaps Eleanor was both victim and witness, her trauma sharpening her perception of horrors others ignored, her mind bending under the weight of truths too heavy to bear alone. Or perhaps her torment was entirely psychological, yet psychology itself becomes complicit when it refuses to acknowledge that power, abuse, and silence are capable of producing experiences indistinguishable from the supernatural. In the end, the letters are less a window into demons or madness than into the machinery of authority itself, and the lesson they leave is as haunting as any apparition, that the most terrifying power is not the presence of evil, but the ability of institutions to decide whether a voice counts as truth or as nothing at all. When Lady Eleanor Ashworth died in 1851, her death was recorded in the parish register with an almost chilling brevity. A fall from the grand stair. No mention of the bruises on her arms described by the maid who found her. No inquiry into why she had been walking alone after midnight. No suggestion that her fall had been anything other than an accident. The official version became the only version, and the silence around her end was nearly as suffocating as the silence that had haunted her letters. In the months following her death, Eleanor's belongings were inventoried, her personal writings seized, and the locked east wing of Ashworth Manor was sealed once more. The letters she had so painstakingly written to her unnamed confidant seemed to vanish with her, leaving only faint whispers among the servants who claimed they had seen a chest carried from her chamber by Lord Ashworth himself. What became of it remained a question no one dared ask. For decades the trail went cold, and the story of Eleanor Ashworth began to calcify into legend, a tale whispered in village pubs, dismissed by scholars, and buried beneath the weight of aristocratic influence. Yet history has a way of clawing back what is buried. In 1909, more than half a century after her supposed accident, workmen contracted to restore the aging manor made a discovery that reignited the embers of her story. While repairing warped floorboards in the disused East Wing, the very wing Eleanor had so often described in her letters, they uncovered a small iron-bound chest, corroded with rust, yet unmistakably preserved. Within it were bundles of paper, brittle with age, bound in ribbon and marked in the elegant hand of Lady Eleanor Ashworth. The chest, hidden beneath layers of wood and dust, had been buried with deliberate care. Its placement beneath the east wing, the wing long sealed from common use, suggested not a casual concealment but an intentional effort to raise her words from memory. Why hide the letters if they were merely the ramblings of a melancholic woman? And why ensure they remained within the manor rather than destroy them outright? These questions struck like lightning when the letters resurfaced, and their rediscovery set off waves of controversy. At first, their unveiling was modest. Portions of the writings were transcribed and submitted to a minor academic journal devoted to English local history. In the summer of 1910, a slim article appeared under the title, The Testimony of Lady Eleanor Ashworth, 1847-1851, an unpublished collection. The article summarized several passages, including her descriptions of rituals in the East Wing and her fears of being watched by men without shadows. But almost as quickly as it appeared, the article vanished. Copies of the journal issue were recalled, and subsequent editions omitted any reference to the piece. The official explanation was mundane. Errors in transcription, lack of verifiable provenance, insufficient academic rigor. Yet whispers in academic circles told a different story. Surviving members of the Ashworth family, though diminished in wealth by the early 20th century, still held influence in certain universities and church parishes. Pressure, it was said, had been applied quietly but firmly. The letters were withdrawn from public discussion not because they lacked value, but because their very existence threatened reputations that stretched back into England's most powerful families. What little had slipped through before suppression was enough to spark the public imagination. Newspapers, particularly in London, speculated on the nature of the writings. Some hinted at occultist sympathies among the landed elite, others at evidence of madness in one of England's great houses. Conspiracy theorists began to circulate pamphlets suggesting that the Ashworths, like other families of wealth, had engaged in rituals designed to consolidate power through means unsanctioned by church or crown. Rumors bloomed of aristocratic cults, secret societies cloaked in the garb of respectability, using manors like Ashworth as stages for rites too ancient and too dangerous to admit openly. The suppression of the letters, rather than erasing them, ensured their transformation into forbidden knowledge, a text whose scarcity only magnified its allure. What fragments remained available through whispers and private copies were enough to divide interpretation sharply. To skeptics, the concealment of the letters was a simple matter of protecting the Ashworth reputation from the stain of scandal. A widow's melancholy, written in florid style and marked with religious anxiety, could be easily misinterpreted as occultism by an eager or sensationalist reader. Better to bury such writings than allow them to be twisted against the family. Yet for others, the very act of concealment was proof of guilt. If the letters were harmless, why suppress them? If Eleanor was merely delusional, why did the Ashworth heirs fear their publication? To silence is to admit power, and in the absence of transparency, imagination filled the void. Private collectors played their part in fanning the mystery. Copies of several pages, allegedly transcribed by the original journal editor before suppression, circulated quietly in rare book markets. These pages, often incomplete, contained some of Eleanor's most unsettling descriptions. The feast where none of the guests moved their lips, yet the prayers continued, or the circle of ash that no servant dared to sweep away. Whether authentic or forgeries, these fragments fueled decades of speculation. Occult researchers seized upon them as proof of continuity between medieval ritual traditions and modern aristocratic practices, while historians of women's writing debated their authenticity as expressions of female trauma. Each interpretation was shaped as much by the interpreter's position as by the content itself, and in this way, Eleanor's voice was once again mediated, reshaped, and contested, never allowed to stand wholly on its own. The tug-of-war between revelation and censorship became, in effect, the true legacy of the letters. Their rediscovery posed not simply the question of what Eleanor had witnessed, but the deeper question of who benefits when certain histories are silenced. For the Ashworth heirs, suppression preserved dignity, shielding the family name from scandal. For the church, suppression prevented uncomfortable overlap between Eleanor's descriptions and rituals too reminiscent of heresy. For academia, suppression offered the safety of avoiding controversy that might jeopardize patronage. And for the public, suppression transformed tragedy into legend, ensuring that Eleanor's story lived not in textbooks, but in whispers, in tales, told by firelight about the lady who heard voices in the manor where mirrors were banned. The paradox is haunting. In trying to erase her words, her suppressors ensured their immortality. Yet the rediscovery also raises an unsettling possibility, that the concealment was not merely reputational but protective. What if the letters, far from being dangerous because of scandal, were dangerous because of content? Some who have studied the rediscovered fragments claim that Eleanor's descriptions correspond not only to cult texts, but to rituals alleged to open thresholds, to summon or bind forces not easily dismissed. Could it be that burying the letters beneath the East Wing was not just an act of suppression, but an act of containment? Did Lord Ashworth, or someone after him, fear that her testimony carried more than ink? That it carried influence, invocation, danger? The absence of definitive answers ensures the debate continues. And perhaps that is the true power of Eleanor's letters. Not that they reveal a clear truth, but that they expose the machinery of narrative control itself. To study them is to confront how history is written, edited, erased, and rewritten, not by those who live it, but by those who hold authority over memory. In the end, the rediscovery of the letters did not resolve Eleanor's story. It multiplied its shadows. Were they cries of madness or confessions of forbidden witness? Was their concealment an aristocratic cover-up, or an attempt to shield the world from knowledge never meant to surface? And when we read the fragments today, are we hearing Eleanor's authentic voice, or the echo of countless mediations imposed upon her words? The suppression and rediscovery of Lady Eleanor Ashworth's letters remind us that history is not simply what happened, but what survives and what is permitted to be believed. The rediscovery of Lady Eleanor Ashworth's letters did not end the debate. It ignited it, scattering possibilities like sparks from a long-smothered fire. Each theory that emerged sought to explain her words, to anchor them within the frameworks of religion, psychology, folklore, or occultism, yet each in turn faltered before the peculiar weight of her testimony. Historians, pragmatic and cautious, were the first to step forward with an interpretation grounded in social context. To them, Eleanor was emblematic of countless aristocratic women of the 19th century, isolated within cavernous estates, deprived of intellectual companionship, and subjected to husbands who ruled not only property but the private lives of their wives with near absolute authority. Her writings in this view were less evidence of ritual than of repression, imaginative flourishes born from neglect and abuse. They argued that the manor itself, with its endless locked corridors and absence of mirrors, created a psychological architecture of unease. Deprived of community, suffocated by silence, Eleanor projected her fears into stories of shadowless guests and whispered voices. In this reading, the letters are not extraordinary but tragically ordinary. One woman's attempt to make sense of loneliness by clothing it in supernatural imagery. Yet psychology pushed the argument further, layering clinical vocabulary over Eleanor's distress. By the early 20th century, the diagnostic label of schizophrenia had gained traction, and retrospective analysis found fertile ground in her words. The auditory hallucinations she described, voices in the nursery, whispers that knew her name, fit neatly into the framework of early psychosis. Her sense of persecution, her belief that her husband engaged in secret rituals, her oscillation between lucidity and paranoia, all of these, psychologists claimed, were textbook symptoms. Theories of female hysteria had already long dismissed women's testimony as pathological, and psychiatry inherited that impulse, reframing Eleanor not as victim, but as patient. Yet even these medicalized interpretations could not explain away everything. Her letters contained details not only of her own fears, but of private transgressions committed by other nobles, references to affairs, debts, and clandestine dealings that later research corroborated through estate ledgers and parish records. How could a delusional mind fabricate truths about others' lives, truths not publicly known until decades later? Here, the psychological explanation cracked, leaving room for doubt. Folklorists entered the discussion with an entirely different lens, noting that Eleanor's accounts aligned with a long tradition of legends surrounding English estates. The motif of the locked wing, the absence of mirrors, the sound of footsteps in empty halls. These were not unique to Ashworth Manor but part of a tapestry of folk belief stretching back centuries. Eleanor, they argued, may have unconsciously absorbed these cultural narratives and reproduced them in her writings. In this view, she was less an inventor of horrors than a vessel for collective memory, giving voice to anxieties embedded in the very stones of the manor. The manor's foundation on monastic ruins lent weight to this theory. Monasteries suppressed during the Reformation were often shrouded in tales of curses, and Ashworth Manor's architecture may have carried such associations into Eleanor's imagination. To folklorists, her words were not delusion but performance, the inevitable echo of a haunted landscape speaking through a sensitive mind. And yet, hovering at the edge of scholarship, occult researchers pressed the most unsettling argument of all. They insisted that Eleanor's writings aligned too closely with ritual texts to be dismissed as coincidence. Her description of circles of salt, of incantations spoken in unfamiliar languages, of offerings that left stains on stone floors, these matched patterns found in grimoires circulated privately among 18th-century secret societies. The precision of her language, they argued, exceeded what an uninitiated woman of her station should have known. How could Eleanor, with no access to libraries of esoteric texts, describe rites in such detail unless she had truly witnessed them? Some scholars even suggested that the absence of mirrors in certain rooms was not eccentricity, but deliberate design, an architectural technique intended to prevent spirits from re-entering the physical world. If this were true, then the manor itself was not merely a setting but a tool, its walls constructed to contain energies as much as to house family. Occultists went further, proposing that Eleanor's death, her fall from the grand stair, was no accident but a silencing, her removal necessary to protect a secret too dangerous to expose. Each theory attempted to resolve the tension, yet none succeeded in closing the case entirely. The historical explanation could not account for her accurate knowledge of aristocratic scandals. The psychological model faltered when her visions coincided with external truths. The folkloric approach explained patterns but not particulars, and the occult reading, while seductive, relied upon evidence too tenuous to satisfy conventional scholarship. Thus, Eleanor's letters remained suspended between possibilities, each interpretation illuminating part of the mystery while leaving its heart in shadow. The persistence of the debate owes as much to present experience as to past testimony. Visitors to Ashworth Manor, now occasionally open for tours, continue to report sensations that echo Eleanor's words. Some speak of sudden drafts in rooms, without windows, of whispers heard in the east wing, though the hall remains sealed, of faint scratches along wooden doors as though something long confined seeks release. Guides dismiss these as tricks of atmosphere, the natural effect of suggestion in a place with a reputation for haunting. Yet the reports continue, and with them the feeling that Eleanor's letters describe not only her own past, but a lingering presence. For skeptics, these experiences confirm the power of narrative. Tell people a place is haunted, and they will hear ghosts. For believers, they confirm that the East Wing holds secrets time has not dispelled. What makes Eleanor's case endure is not the clarity of her testimony, but its refusal to be pinned down. Every theory leaves a residue of the unexplained, a gap through which doubt creeps. Was she a lonely woman spinning fantasy from silence? A patient descending into madness? A storyteller echoing folklore older than herself? Or a witness to rituals, whose memory powerful families sought desperately to erase? Each answer leaves the reader unsatisfied, compelled to circle back, to reread her words, to linger in the ambiguity. Perhaps that is the point. Eleanor's letters resist resolution because they were never meant to offer closure. They were written in secrecy, to a confidant who remains unnamed, as if intended for an audience that could never reply. They are both confession and testimony, both madness and revelation, both personal diary and political document. To approach them is to step into the same corridors she described. Corridors without mirrors, where one cannot be sure whether the figure glimpsed in the dark is another, or merely one's own reflection distorted. Theories multiply, but certainty never arrives. And in that space of unknowing, Eleanor's voice continues to breathe. That is the lingering mystery, not whether the letters are true in a literal sense, but whether truth itself can be disentangled from power, perception, and fear. Like the manor that birthed them, they're built of stone and shadow, a house where every door opens onto another question. And so, more than a century and a half after her death, Lady Eleanor Ashworth has achieved, in death what she was denied in life, to be heard if never fully understood. Lady Eleanor Ashworth's forbidden letters remain suspended between history and myth, an artifact that defies final interpretation. To some, they are the fragmented writings of a fragile mind, the tragic diary of a woman trapped within the golden cage of aristocracy, where silence was demanded and obedience enforced. To others, they are a doorway, an unintentional revelation of hidden worlds that England's elite labored endlessly to conceal. The Church condemned her as sinful, accusing her of consorting with devils by daring to write of rituals and shadows. Physicians of her era branded her hysterical, their diagnoses shaped less by medicine than by the conviction that women could not be trusted with their own words. Historians, in turn, have struggled to decide whether her testimony belongs to literature, delusion, or dangerous truth. And yet, none of these interpretations seem enough. The lingering weight of Eleanor's voice is not so easily dismissed. Each letter still carries the tremor of someone both terrified and determined, as though she knew her words would outlive her, though not in the way she intended. The manor itself seems to conspire in her endurance. Its locked east wing, its silence-laden corridors, its absence of mirrors, as though the architecture still holds her memory. Visitors report whispers and sudden chills, details eerily consistent with Eleanor's descriptions, and whether coincidence or continuation, They fuel the uneasy sense that her voice has never ceased. What unsettles most is not the question of what Eleanor saw, but what she forces us to confront. The way's power silences truth, the ease with which institutions, church, medicine, family, can rewrite a woman's voice into madness, sin, or rumor. The letters demand we ask whether we are complicit in repeating that same dismissal, whether our search for neat explanations is another form of silencing. Perhaps Eleanor's warnings were genuine, perhaps they were figments of a mind pushed to its breaking point, or perhaps they were something in between. Truth translated through the language of terror. But what if the greater danger lies not in the letters themselves, but in our refusal to sit with their ambiguity? Ashworth Manor still stands, its reputation outwardly untarnished, its history polished for polite society. Yet beneath its floors once lay a chest of words that refused to be buried. Those words remind us that some secrets do not die with their keepers. Eleanor's voice, silenced in life, continues through ink, fragile, fractured, but unrelenting. And so the question remains, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Were these the cries of a woman unraveling, or the testimony of one who glimpsed the shadowed bargains upon which power was built? The truth, like the locked east wing, remains closed to us. All that is left is her voice, echoing through time, daring us to decide whether we will keep listening, or whether, like those before us, we will turn the key and seal the door once more.